After 1945, the world stood at a crossroads, forever changed by the devastation of World War II. The global landscape was being redrawn, and the world was split in two. On one side, the United States and its allies, representing a vision of freedom and self-determination. On the other, the Soviet Union with its own distinct ideology and sphere of influence. Democracy and capitalism, the cornerstones of the Western world, faced off against communism, a system promising equality, but often delivering oppression. This ideological clash ignited a global struggle known as the Cold War. This was a conflict fought not with direct military confrontation but through spies, proxy wars, where smaller nations became battlegrounds for larger ideological conflicts, and a relentless battle for global influence, as each superpower sought to expand its reach. The domino theory gripped America, the fear that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow, like a row of dominoes toppling one after another. Vietnam, with its long and arduous fight for independence from colonial rule, became the central flashpoint in this global chess game. Ho Chi Minh, a charismatic figure, led Vietnamese nationalists seeking unity and self-determination for their nation, but his communist ties and revolutionary ideology deeply alarmed U.S. leaders. America, viewing the world through the lens of the Cold War, saw Vietnam not as a fight for freedom, but as a crucial front in the global war against communism's spread. Determined to stop the perceived red tide of communism from engulfing Southeast Asia, the U.S. poured vast amounts of money, military equipment, and advisors into South Vietnam. But the Saigon government, plagued by internal divisions, was riddled with corruption and, critically, lacked genuine popular support among the Vietnamese people. America's commitment deepened with each passing year, inexorably tying its fate to what would ultimately become a losing cause. The stage was set for a long and brutal war that would profoundly define a generation of Americans and Vietnamese alike. The slow escalation, fueled by Cold War anxieties, would soon become a full-blown conflict, costing millions of lives and leaving deep scars on both nations. The dense jungles of Vietnam, a land of ancient beauty, became the line in the sand, a testing ground for American resolve and military might. But the tragedy, with all its complexities and consequences, was only beginning to unfold. U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalated rapidly, particularly after the murky events of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. President Johnson, leveraging the incident, gained broad authority from Congress to wage war, and the first official combat troops arrived on Vietnamese soil in 1965. Young Americans, many of whom were promised a swift and decisive victory, soon found themselves facing a hidden and elusive enemy, immersed in a brutal and unforgiving jungle warfare. The Viet Cong's innovative guerrilla tactics, coupled with the unwavering resolve of the North Vietnamese army, made every single day on patrol an exercise in uncertainty and fear. There were no clearly defined front lines, just the constant gnawing presence of danger lurking around every corner. Major battles, such as the bloody clash at Ia Drang in 1965, and the widespread chaos of the Tet Offensive, brutally shattered any lingering illusions of a swift and easy victory for the Americans. The Tet Offensive, while ultimately a military setback for the North Vietnamese forces, proved to be a devastating political disaster for the U.S. government. The war dragged on relentlessly, year after agonizing year, marked by relentless bombing campaigns and the widespread use of chemical defoliants, such as the infamous Agent Orange. Despite the overwhelming advantage in firepower and technological superiority, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong forces stubbornly endured the onslaught. American soldiers, many mere teenagers, fought with incredible bravery, but the conflict increasingly resembled a hopeless quagmire, swallowing everything in its path. The U.S. faced a grim reality of mounting casualties, both physical and psychological, and a frustrating lack of any clear or attainable path leading towards victory. The brutal conflict stretched from the dense, humid jungles to the chaotic and dangerous city streets, leaving a trail of widespread destruction and devastation in its wake. For every soldier caught in the crossfire, there was a profound sense of confusion, a deep feeling of loss, and the ever-present haunting sense of being trapped in a war with no foreseeable end. The sheer brutality and apparent futility of the war became increasingly impossible for the American public to ignore any longer. America was undeniably and deeply trapped in the Vietnam quagmire. At home, Vietnam became the first televised war, a conflict brought directly into people's homes through the power of broadcast television. Night after night, the horrors of the war unfolded in American living rooms, creating a visceral connection to the conflict. The public increasingly saw a stark and unsettling contrast between the official optimism spouted by government officials and the grim reality unfolding on their television screens. Fueled by this dissonance, a powerful and vocal anti-war movement erupted across the nation. This movement was led by a diverse coalition of students, returning veterans disillusioned by their experiences, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life. Protests swept the nation, growing in size and intensity as the war dragged on. Demonstrations included draft card burnings, acts of defiance that symbolized resistance to the war. There were also massive marches on Washington, where hundreds of thousands gathered to voice their opposition. The country was deeply divided, with Americans fiercely debating the war's morality, its strategic rationale, and its devastating human cost. Amidst this turmoil, President Nixon promised peace with honor to the American people. He announced a policy of Vietnamization, a strategy focused on gradually withdrawing U.S. troops and transferring responsibility to the South Vietnamese army. However, as Americans began to leave, the fighting on the ground actually intensified. The conflict tragically spilled over into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, further destabilizing the region. The withdrawal process was slow, arduous, and painful for all involved. Chaos and instability spread rapidly across Southeast Asia, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. In 1973, the last U.S. combat troops officially departed from Vietnam, but the Paris Peace Accords, intended to bring an end to the conflict, ultimately failed to secure a lasting peace. In 1975, the inevitable occurred. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The world watched in stunned silence, as desperate South Vietnamese civilians clung to the skids of helicopters desperately evacuating personnel from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy. The Vietnam War ended in a resounding defeat and a profound sense of humiliation for the United States. The domino had indeed fallen, and the human and economic cost of the war was simply staggering. Vietnam was irrevocably lost. The fall of Saigon sent shockwaves worldwide and changed American foreign policy forever. The U.S. adopted a more cautious approach, expecting allies to defend themselves, the so-called Vietnam Syndrome. Public trust in government collapsed after revelations like the Pentagon Papers. Americans became skeptical of official narratives, fueling a more adversarial press. The war's impact reached beyond the U.S., hastening the end of colonialism and inspiring independence movements. The non-aligned movement gained strength as nations sought their own path. In Asia, Cambodia faced new horrors under the Khmer Rouge. Vietnam became a cautionary tale about the limits of military power and the dangers of ideological certainty. The lessons of Vietnam shaped future U.S. conflicts and public opinion. Wars are fought not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of people. The legacy of Vietnam endures, a reminder of war's human cost and the need for diplomacy.